Okay, so thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's unfortunate I can't come to Seoul, but I'm looking forward to doing that sometime in the future. So today I'm going to talk about not about parallelism as we know it, but about parallelism's evil cousin, atomicity, and how this classical notion has evolved over time. So the material I'm going to talk about comes from a bunch of papers, including joint work with Barbara Liskov, Luba Shrira, and my student Ingje Shui. Now, Carol happens to own a pink Cadillac. She's very fond of this car, but then eventually she heard about this Bitcoin thing and decided that, well, Cadillacs aren't very practical, but Bitcoin, might be more useful. So she decides she's going to sell her Cadillac in return for some number of Bitcoin. Now, this story happens in the future where car titles are kept on a blockchain. If you don't like blockchains, imagine it as a highly available, highly secure, highly slow database. Now, the car title blockchain and the Bitcoin blockchain are, of course, distinct. Now, Alice decides that she wants to buy this Cadillac, but she doesn't own any Bitcoin. Instead, she owns some other coin. In this case, let's pick Tether. And here, too, the car title blockchain and the Tether blockchain are distinct entities. Now, there's a third party, Bob, who happens to own lots of Bitcoin and decides he wants to diversify and buy some Tether. So I think you can see where this is going. What we would like to do is we'd like to set up a three-way exchange where every party gets what they want. Carol sells her Cadillac to Alice. Alice sells her Tether to Bob, and Bob sells his Bitcoin to Carol. And everyone ends up in a perfectly happy state. Now, the problem here is that this is we're living in a kind of libertarian hell where nobody trusts anybody, and in fact, this is a little bit like arranging a deal on Craigslist or arranging a deal among Camorra clans. Alice is thinking, if I get a chance, I'm totally going to steal that Cadillac because what can Carol do? Bob is actually not that interested in making a profit. He just wants to create chaos. Maybe he works for some intelligence agency for some foreign power that wants to disrupt the economy. And of course, Carol is thinking, well, actually, I kind of like this car. Maybe I can use this to swindle my co-parties, my counterparties, into giving me money for nothing. So this is one of the oldest primordial problems that people have faced, where you have a number of parties that can get substantial benefit if they can cooperate, but they don't trust one another. And in fact, there's no mechanisms for resolving conflicts. There's no recourse to lawsuits, arbitration, and so on. This is exactly the problem that arbitrarily led to the reason people invented civilization, is to provide a mechanism to do this. But in the world of blockchains and cryptocurrencies, we're kind of back in the Stone Age, where there is no rule of law and no ability to enforce any kind of agreements after the fact. So things have to be set up to work properly the first time. And I want to emphasize that even though blockchains and cryptocurrency are very much in the news, they have a kind of sleazy reputation in some quarters. Mostly when you read about it in the news, it's because something has gone terribly wrong and a bunch of people lost a lot of money, usually people who deserve to lose a lot of money. And so, sometimes people don't take this area seriously. But I want to emphasize that this is a serious scientific area, if you look hard enough. And this talk is totally not about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, I'm sure, of great interest if you happen to own some. Scientifically, I'm not sure there's that much going on there anymore. It's more a topic of sensationalistic popcorn munching reading than real science at this point. And it's not really even about blockchains. A blockchain is really a kind of technology, and it's used very loosely. For example, there are systems that call themselves blockchains that are not organized as chains of blocks, but they still use the term blockchain so that you know what they're talking about. So a blockchain is technology. The real abstraction are, as I said before, distributed ledgers, highly available, tamper-proof databases, and so on. And one kind of whimsical way to talk about this is to say we want to do trust-free synchronization. We want to be able to cooperate to mutual benefit without, I won't say with no trust whatsoever. That's a little bit naive, but very limited, very quantifiable and identifiable forms of trust. Now, I'm coming at this problem from a background in distributed computing. And of course, the same way that database people think that they invented everything, we in the distributed computing community think that we invented everything. And so the way that we tend to reason about and explain our algorithms is in terms of adversaries. So in classical distributed computing, we have a kind of a cute and well-defined adversary. So the adversary can control timing. So I want to construct a protocol where it still works if the messages arrive late. An adversary might be able to control crashes. I want to replicate a database or a file system across a number of servers where a certain number of servers are allowed to crash. A certain number of messages are allowed to be lost. In extreme circumstances, I might be willing to tolerate Byzantine failures. And by Byzantine here, it's really this kind of weird Bayesian model where I know that the equipment can go haywire. I'm too lazy to figure out how it can go haywire, so I'm going to pretend that it could be malicious, even though I don't really believe it's malicious. It's just kind of random. And given this kind of adversary, the distributed computing community focused on a number of very simple, well-defined problems, like consensus, renaming. There's a whole list of problems that people have published papers on, but they're very precisely mathematically defined. They're kind of small problems. This is how people like me have made a living for a long time. Now today's world, however, is much more demanding. So today, the adversary is not a mathematical abstraction. The adversary is a real person sitting in some cafe in Central Asia or sitting in intelligence organization's headquarters in some some capital somewhere. And this has the property that your adversary is intelligent. The adversary is persistent. That person in a cafe in Baku who breaks your smart contract will become rich for the rest of their lives, so they're really quite determined. The kinds of attacks are much more sophisticated, and attacks don't always require you to do the wrong thing. Denial of service attacks, nuisance attacks are a thing. So an adversary might be able to spend lots of resources simply to slow things down and make your life difficult. And this is, of course, hard because adversaries don't respect abstractions. You might have a nice, cleanly defined system, but the adversaries can find the cracks between where the bricks come together. So this is a much more complex and demanding kind of environment. And the kind of problems that we're called on to solve are much less clearly defined. Instead of doing consensus, we want to do free and fair elections. We want to do a stock market that can't be manipulated. We want to have power grids that cannot be brought to their knees every time there's a dispute with a neighbor. And these are much more complicated, but also much more important problems than the kinds of things that we've been looking at. Now, you may be wondering what all this has to do with parallelism or even distributed computing, but I will get there. what I want to do in this talk is not to talk about algorithms and protocols and data structures. I want to talk about how a change in adversaries from a relatively benign adversary to a malicious adversary should affect our notions of correctness. And I'm covering this because I see a lot of work where people assume that older notions of correctness work perfectly well in this new environment. So they derive brilliant algorithms and data structures which actually do what they're supposed to do, but people are a little bit fuzzy about what they're supposed to do. And so I want to propose some notions of correctness that are appropriate to this day and age. Now, in the spirit of keynote addresses, I'm going to try to provoke more than illuminate, perhaps. So I'm going to express a lot of opinions. I hope this provokes a debate. I'm planning to leave a bunch of time at the end of the talk for questions. And so I'm going to try to provoke people into thinking about this area, because I'm not going to claim that everything I say is even true. And in the spirit of blockchain and cryptocurrency, I may be actually telling you things that aren't entirely true just to be a nuisance. Now, the database people, in some sense, really did invent everything at the beginning of time, meaning the 1980s. And they thought a lot about what distributed databases should do. So an activity in databases is typically called a transaction. If the participants in the transaction are distributed, then we call it a distributed transaction. And the classical model says, well, what do we want distributed transactions to do? Well, we can identify this as what's called the ACID properties. ACID is an acronym for atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. Now, I'm actually not a big fan of this particular way of breaking things down, but it's become classical, so this is how we talk. And what I want to do is I want to say that the ACID properties, which have been thoroughly studied and redesigned, if you want to propose a new correctness condition for a transaction, then the condition you don't satisfy are the ACID properties. So what I claim is that these notions are deceptive because they look like they work in a malicious environment, but they fall short in a number of subtle and not so subtle ways. So what I want to do is I want to go through each of these properties and explain how we want them to change, how we need them to change when we talk about how to do distributed transactions in a malicious environment. And in particular, I want to tie this back to our classical notions of concurrency, synchronization, and even parallelism. So let's start out with the adversarial model. The most, in some sense, classical schemes, Paxos and Raft, which are distributed state machines, they assume that the majority of participants don't crash. So if you're going to misbehave, you can crash. You can fall silent. You either follow the protocol or you stay silent. And as long as a majority follow the protocol, then all is well. And of course, there's an industry of researchers that investigate this area. There is a Byzantine agreement. Byzantine is looking at Byzantine generals, Byzantine consensus. Was trendy for a long time, then it kind of fell out of favor as the questions became more and more abstruse, and now Byzantine has come back. And there, in most of the kinds of protocols, the assumption is that at least more than two-thirds of the participants follow the protocol correctly. The other can do anything they want. So this is, of course, a more demanding model than the Paxos and Raft model, but it addresses different problems. There are even more refined models. There have been proposals to say, well, we can divide the participants into three classes. There are the Byzantine, who can do arbitrarily bad things, the altruistic, who always follow the protocol no matter what, and the rational, who are happy to do the right thing but will cheat if given the opportunity. If there is a profit to be made, they will defect and cheat, but otherwise will behave. And there are proposals for different kinds of coordination protocols based on this model. And my premise here is that none of these make sense in this particular model that where the adversaries are malicious. Each of these models makes perfect sense in their context. So I'm not attacking the models. I'm saying that this isn't the kind of model that we want to carry forward into this brave new libertarian world of mutually suspicious distributed ledgers. So we're going to have a very simple dichotomy. We'll say a party is conforming if it follows the protocol. By the protocol, I mean the participants get together and they agree on a nominal protocol that everyone should follow. Actually following this protocol can't be enforced. It can be monitored. You might be able to tell if someone is cheating, but you can't force them to follow the protocol. So the participants who actually swear an oath to follow the protocol and then do so are called conforming. The ones that aren't conforming are deviating. And they can follow any protocol they like. They can do anything. And this is the entire model. That there are conforming parties, there are deviating parties, and most importantly, there is no bound on the number of deviating parties. Now, there are certainly contexts where it makes sense to insist on such a bound. So if you're implementing a blockchain, you might want a majority of your miners to be honest. But if you're organizing a drug deal among a number of mafia families, there's no guarantee that a majority of the mafia families are going to follow the protocol. And the same can be said for something like Craigslist. So we're not going to assume that a majority or even any particular fraction are honest. Typically, we assume that at least one is honest because otherwise it's not very interesting. So let's go back to the acid properties and revisit each one of those from the perspective of our hostile model. So the first property in the acid acronym is atomicity. And atomicity is usually expressed as the property that either all steps happen or no steps happen. That if I'm trying to reserve a hotel room and buy an airplane ticket, then either I get the reservation and the ticket, or I get neither one. I don't end up in any kind of partial intermediate state. Now, actually, all or nothing is impossible when parties can deviate, because I can't prevent an adversary from, say, giving me their money. Now, you might say, well, this can't happen. No rational adversary would do that, but you can't assume that your adversaries are rational. The adversary might have a virus. They might be trying to disrupt things, and they don't care about the cost. So this sounds a little bit like a technicality, but actually it's very important. We cannot guarantee all or nothing if we cannot guarantee that some of the participants can deviate from the protocol. Instead, we need to take this all or nothing property and make it a little bit more complicated and divide it up into safety and liveness properties. So our liveness property is pretty straightforward. It says if everyone behaves, then the deal goes through. And of course, I'm going to be informal here and rely on your intuition to understand what that means. So it says if all goes well, then the deal happens. Carol sells her Cadillac, gets her Bitcoin, so on and so on. That's kind of a minimal requirement that you would want of any protocol. And then you want a safety property that says that if some of the participants deviate, then the conforming parties end up no worse off. Now, saying something like this is fighting words for a lot of people in our community. This is kind of a full employment act for our formalist friends. Intuitively, that says that if you're honest, you can't be cheated. Now, of course, I'm being being deliberately a little bit imprecise here because I could spend the rest of the talk explaining what I mean by no worse off, but I'm going to give you a kind of high-level view. We're going to have to borrow some notions from elementary game theory. So by no worse off, think of it this way. Any kind of cross-chain deal is a cooperative game in the sense that the participants engage in a series of interactions and everyone ends up with something. So a protocol is a strategy for following that game. It's a set of rules that says, Alice says if Bob does this, then I do that. There's a kind of default protocol that the conforming parties all follow, and the deviating parties can follow any protocol that they want. And in particular, we assume that parties can form coalitions. That means that if I agree to a deal with 3 other people on Craigslist, they might all be plotting against me. And they might do something that is individually irrational for one player, but is perfectly rational for a coalition. Or they might even do something that's irrational for the coalition. I can't tell. And the result of following your protocol is the payoff. So these are kind of standard terms. There's nothing particularly profound here. This is just the language in which we want to describe things. And then, what are the payoffs? If you think of the point of view of Alice trying to sell her Cadillac, what are the possible things that could happen? Well, the deal could happen. So everything could go as planned. Everyone pays what they expected to pay. They get what they expected to get. And pretty much we assume that if the deal happens, then everyone is better off because they wouldn't have agreed to the deal in the first place if they weren't better off. The second thing that can happen is the transaction can be canceled or aborted. In that case, no assets change hands. And we're going to stretch things a little by saying that, well, this is also an acceptable outcome. It's not a desired outcome, but it's acceptable. And in fact, we're going to hedge that a little bit later on in the talk. But for now, let's just assume that people are unhappy but basically okay with it if the deal falls through, but no harm is done. Something else that can happen is Alice might be able to take somebody's coins without giving up title to her Cadillac. This might happen because Alice is crafty and cheats. This might happen because Alice's counterparty is incompetent. But in an environment where you can't control autonomous parties, this is something that could happen, at least in theory, and it's something that our notion of correctness has to be able to encompass because otherwise it isn't reflecting reality. A final outcome is you could be cheated. So Alice might give up title to her Cadillac and not collect any coins, or collect fewer coins, or collect coins of the wrong kind. Again, the duty of the person designing the distributed protocol is to make sure that can't happen, but our notions of correctness have to encompass that possibility. And in fact, if Alice cheats, for example, she might, if she herself cheats, she might end up losing her Cadillac. So we're going to assume that any of these 3 outcomes means translate into no worse off. Now, again, I'm being a little bit imprecise here. There are finer distinctions in the outcomes that can and should be made if we were doing this more precisely, but this is good enough to convey the basic idea. And you're worse off if somebody takes your goods and doesn't pay you, or pays you less than they should. So that's what we mean by atomicity in this context, that if everyone behaves, things go through. If something goes wrong and you're honest, you don't end up worse off. The next property is called consistency. And this one, frankly, has always bothered me a little bit in terms of the ACID formulation. Consistency says that application-specific constraints are respected. And this differs from the others in the sense that it isn't quite precise, because what is an application-specific constraint anyway? But this is a good place to talk about different kinds of application-specific constraints that arise in this kind of context. So here too, we're going to steal some ideas from elementary game theory. And basically what we're saying, the technical term is that conforming to the protocol should be a strong Nash equilibrium strategy. Now let me take a second to kind of explain what that means. So a strong Nash equilibrium says that we have a situation where a number of players are participating in a game, and everyone is given a default strategy. We all agree, yes, we will follow this protocol when we interact. And if a coalition gets together and they plot to deviate from the strategy, they're going to cheat and do something that they promised they wouldn't do, that they won't improve their payoff. So it says that a rational person won't cheat if everyone agrees to follow a particular protocol, because they won't gain anything. Now let me emphasize that does not mean that you can assume that they won't cheat, because we don't assume that the deviating parties are rational. But if everyone were rational, then they would have no incentive to cheat. No, it's dangerous to assume that people won't cheat, again, because you don't really know what their objective function really is. But what we're saying is, if you take a kind of a small game hypothesis and assume that everyone is simply trying to maximize their gain, that they have no incentive to cheat. So I won't have time to talk about what this implies, but there are a number of interesting implications here. So remember the three-way swap that we talked about. You can generalize this to arbitrary directed graphs. So here we have a very complicated, almost a baroquely complicated swap, where each vertex represents a party, each arc represents a transfer of an asset, and our problem is to devise a protocol that guarantees that either all of the swaps happen or none of them do. Oh wait, that's impossible. We're going to guarantee that if you conform, that either all of your swaps happen or none of them do. You don't know what happens at the other end of the directed graph. And there's a interesting result here that says that suppose I have a protocol that guarantees that every conforming party ends up no worse off. And again, this can be made more precise. If you have such a protocol, and in fact these protocols do exist, then that's also that following that protocol is a strong Nash equilibrium strategy if and only if the digraph is strongly connected. That is, if there's a path from any party to any other party in the graph. So this is kind of interesting because it says that the topological properties of the directed graph defining the deal has implications for the sort of game theoretic properties of the deal. And this is independent of the actual protocol. Pretty much what happens is if this is not strongly connected, then you can prove that somebody is getting a free ride in the sense that they're accumulating assets without giving any assets up. Whoever it is that's giving them those assets has no incentive to do so because they can always make a profit by pretending they gave those assets and not doing it, and so on. So there are implications for each of these correctness conditions. The next property is called isolation, and this is the one that's most like a concurrency control. So this says that no transaction can see another's intermediate states. That is, if I'm a transaction and you're a transaction, my view of the world is either you already happened or you didn't happen. I don't see any inconsistent intermediate states of the world. This is where we get properties like serializability, linearizability, snapshot consistency, sequential consistency. There's an entire decades and decades of study of different consistency properties in databases and distributed systems. They range from very strong to very weak. But they're all based on some notion of isolation. You either can't see intermediate states or there are restrictions on the kinds of intermediate states you can see. Now, in the cross-chain world, however, these properties aren't really helpful. And the reason is that if you look at these protocols for doing things like swaps or auctions or broker transfers and so on, they're multi-step protocols where one party puts something into escrow and then another party, when they observe that, they put something into escrow and then somebody releases a cryptographic key and then somebody releases another cryptographic key. So the protocols themselves are long sequences of very careful and tentative interactions. And so the idea that you can accomplish anything by running in isolation simply doesn't make sense in this context. So the key notion behind all this is the notion of escrow. So in order for Alice to transfer her Cadillac in exchange for some Bitcoin, you end up transferring the control of your asset to a program called a smart contract. This is called escrow. And escrow is very analogous to locking data in a database. It's like a two-phase lock in a database or a mutex lock in a concurrent data structure. It says that I'm going to take something of value and I'm going to, in some sense, isolate it for some period of time. And safety says, it's something like two-phase locking. It says that assets placed in escrow can't be unlocked until the deal is complete. So if I put something in escrow, I can't unlock it prematurely because either then I could grab it back or someone else could steal it. So assets typically have to be locked up until the deal is complete. There doesn't seem to be any kind of analog of lock-free synchronization here. There's no escrow-free swaps that I'm aware of. That would be an awesome PhD thesis if you could figure out how to do that. But right now, you want to exchange goods with someone, you have to put your goods in escrow. The liveness side is that you don't want assets to be locked in escrow forever. And there are examples in the smart contract world of people who wrote effective smart contracts where enormous amounts of assets end up being locked up forever because people forgot or mismanaged the process of unlocking them. Now, there's an aspect of this that I wanted to talk about. Now, remember I said that no deal was an acceptable, if not desired, outcome. The idea that I can set up an elaborate transaction, put things in escrow, and the deal falls through, I'm happy as long as I get my money back. Well, that's actually not quite true. I will not be happy if I get my money back. So imagine we set up one of these deals. I lock up my Cadillac. I'm waiting for you to lock up your Bitcoin, and maybe you lock up your Bitcoin, but something goes wrong, and the exchange never happens. The counterparty walks away in the middle. It says, let's make a deal, lock up your stuff, haha, I'm leaving. Now, it's not that hard to design the protocol so it's fail-safe in the sense that you get your assets back. Nobody can steal your stuff. But there is the property that you only get your stuff back after a long delay. So existing hash time lock atomic swap protocols, for example, you might lock up your Bitcoin for 24 hours or 48 hours, which is an eternity in this context. So you get your assets back after a long delay, but that's not very satisfactory if you're living in a cryptocurrency world where assets are highly volatile, where there are runs on the bank, panics, scandals, all kinds of things, where you want to be able to turn on a dime and dump your assets if the price is falling, or buy new assets if the curve is going up. So this is a problem that's long been solved in the real world using techniques that we'll talk about now. Translating these into the blockchain world, though, represents a number of interesting challenges. So there's a principle that says that if you walk away from the middle of a deal, you should pay a small fee called a premium to the others for their time. If I go to my real estate agent and say, hey, I want to buy a house, the real estate agent and the seller might be worried that I'm just going to waste their time. I'm going to negotiate for a month and then walk away. So in the real world, what you do is you put down a deposit. So I can say, well, okay, I'd like to buy this $1 million house. Here's a $1,000 deposit. If I walk away, you can keep the $1,000. And this gives me an incentive to not waste people's time, and it compensates people whose time is wasted. Now, this is, I think, far from a solved problem, but it kind of illuminates some of the scientific challenges in this area. So one question is, how do you identify who's guilty? You can't really trust anyone. Nobody's going to confess. So you need to devise your protocols in such a way that it's clear who it is whose fault is it that the deal didn't go through. And sometimes this is an algorithmic challenge. Looking from outside the system, you can see who's guilty. The only question is, how do you get the protocol to figure that out based on incomplete local knowledge and deceptive behavior by the participants. And sometimes there's a philosophical problem. If the network is slow and someone times out, then whose fault is it that the deal didn't go through? And there the question is, how do you design protocols that in some sense fairly blame the parties at risk? There's an interesting bootstrapping problem. Before I can escrow my Cadillac, I need to escrow my premiums. But if I escrow my premiums, what's to keep me from walking out in the middle of that particular protocol? So that means, do I need to have premiums on top of my premiums? Is it possible to design something where everyone is protected all the time? Pretty much the answer is no, but you can lower the risk to an arbitrarily small degree. But lowering this risk increases the traffic, it increases your cost, and increases time. So there are many interesting trade-offs between how do you hedge your transactions and how do you, and the complexity of your protocols. This is an area that's crying out for lower bounds. Right now we don't have any. And a question that's close to my heart is, can hedging be automated? Can I come up with a specification for a deal and automatically generate a kind of a sub-protocol that sets up premiums and hedging so that you can embark on this confident that if someone wastes your time, at least you get some kind of a compensation? So this is an example of a kind of active area. I have a student currently who's working on these and related problems. Okay, the final asset property is called durability. And this is in some sense the easiest to satisfy. If anything, blockchains and distributed ledgers oversatisfy this. So this comes from a day and age when memory was volatile and disks represented the long-lived truth of the system. The state of the database was the state of the disk plus the state of the log. And the nature of disk technology pretty much determined the nature of how databases were organized. And in some sense, this is exactly what blockchains are intended to do, except instead of crashes and disk crashes, at least in principle, blockchains are concerned with what's called censorship, attempts to interfere with the blockchain by large corporations, by governments, by organized crime, by your nosy neighbor, by hackers, etc. And so the goal here is, by replicating things all over the place, it makes it very hard to tamper with the contents of the database. It makes it hard to prevent authorized parties from using the database to transact and so on. And this is there's a lot written about this, with political and social agendas. Technically, it's not all that interesting a problem, but this is a big deal in some circles. Okay, so to wrap up, the no keynote address is complete without a rousing call to open research areas. So the model here is, imagine that you're sitting around trying to decide what to do for your PhD thesis. I'm going to suggest a number of open questions related to this kind of area. Again, the theme here is that, in some sense, a lot of these problems have already been solved in other contexts. Doing them in a hyper-malicious environment adds interesting kind of twists. So one question is, programming language designed for these kinds of protocols. So these protocols are written in terms of units called smart contracts. Now, the term smart contract is just marketing hype. These aren't contracts in any legal sense, and they're not particularly smart either. You can think of them as shell scripts for money. But language designed for these smart contracts is a kind of bizarro antimatter image of normal programming languages. So everything that's good in normal programming language is bad in a smart contract language. So information and modularity are actually not good things to have in a smart contract language. So, Carol wants to sell her Cadillac. She's going to transfer ownership of that Cadillac to a smart contract, to this shell script that's running on a blockchain somewhere. She wants to know exactly what it does, because there are lots and lots of stories, both tragic and comic, of people who've lost their shirts because they overlooked some bug in a smart contract. And so high-level information hiding and modularity is great when you're writing a file server or an operating system. But it's really not a great idea when you're writing a smart contract, because you really want to check every detail. And every place where the modules are glued together is a potential vulnerability. This is kind of controversial, and some people get very angry when you say this. But there are many people who feel that having a Turing-complete programming language for smart contracts is a bad idea. Why is this? Well, you want to do as much static analysis as possible. I don't want dynamic analysis. I don't want to transfer $1 million to a smart contract, and the smart contract says, oh, wait a second, you tried to add a string and an integer together. I'm crashing and keeping your money. You want to do static analysis, and being Turing-complete makes static analysis hard, to say the very least. So a number of proposals for smart contract languages are restricted. They don't have concurrency. They don't have unbounded loops. They don't have recursion. Again, people's opinions differ on this, but I think Turing completeness in this context is more of a nuisance than a help. Non-determinism is evil. The code is re-executed by lots of people. Nobody trusts anyone else to execute the code, so everyone re-executes the code themselves. If honest parties can differ on the outcome of a computation, then it's going to be very hard to reach any kind of agreement. Eliminating non-determinism from a language is harder than you think. Again, this makes concurrency very tricky. Even things like floating point become difficult. Things like indirection, function pointers, dynamic dispatch, all of these things that are such fun to use in regular programming languages become problematic at best in smart contract languages. So in some sense, the simpler and the dumber, the better you are. Correctness. I spent most of the first part of the talk talking about correctness. Now, this is an area where weak consistency is very common. You ask people who write Ethereum smart contracts, so what exactly is your notion of correctness? You get some kind of interesting answers. There's a lot of disagreement about what things should do. There's some disagreement about what they actually do. There are a lot of bad actors who make profits over disagreements about what things actually do. There's a colorful history of exploits where people have stolen large amounts of money from other people by exploiting so-called bugs in contracts. But bugs aren't really bugs in this context. A bug can be defined as a discrepancy between an implementation and a specification. The implementation does something that the specification didn't anticipate. But smart contracts typically don't have any specification. The code is the specification. The libertarian bros love to run around saying code is law, man. And if code is law, then you should be saying specification is law. But in this environment with no specs, it's even hard to tell whether stealing money is a crime. If I exploit a bug in your contract and take all your money, can you call the FBI? I could say, well, code is law. You agree to this, that stuff. This wouldn't happen with a real contract. If we sign a contract in the real world and I exploit some technicality and take all your money, the police are going to arrest me because the intent of a contract, the specification, takes precedence over the details. This is why smart contracts are not really contracts. Again, and I can't insist on this too much, the idea that your programs have to withstand malicious attack, I guess from a formalist point of view, it doesn't make any effect, but in every real sense, it does. We live with programs that have latent bugs all the time. And people know about these bugs, and sometimes they say, well, here's a theoretical bug. It's too expensive to fix this. It never manifests itself. If it does, we can repair any damage. But that doesn't work if your adversary is malicious and determined. If you have even a minor bug and it can be exploited, it will be exploited. So in a non-blockchain context, you might say, well, who cares? This will never happen. In a blockchain context, if someone can make a profit from exploiting it, you can be sure they will. And again, let me repeat, this isn't entirely true. You can call the FBI if somebody if somebody steals your money steals your Bitcoin, but it probably won't do you much good. Moving down the stack, there are lots of interesting questions having to do with the implementation of these systems. So the interaction between blockchain and storage is something that I think could benefit from further scrutiny. So people describe blockchains as the world's largest and slowest databases, because blockchains, they're ledgers and they have data. There's been a lot of interest in mixing systems with on-chain and off-chain storage. And I'm currently a visiting scientist at Algorand working on their smart contract architecture. And one of the issues that comes up is what's the interaction between blockchains and, say, databases? Real blockchains keep their data on actual databases. So the blockchain is kind of a replication manager for off-the-shelf simple databases. The question is, what units should be atomic? This is both a pragmatic and a kind of philosophical question. To what degree are nested atomic operations useful and sensible and safe? What should be durable? What kinds of things you want to last and what can you throw out? And there are some agonizing security versus efficiency dilemmas. You could say, well, if we do things this way, then there's a remote possibility that somebody can figure out a denial of service attack that exploits this. People can waste our time if we undercharge for some computation. Then maybe people will call our sign function a zillion times and pay $1 million instead of the $1.5 million it costs us. And these are difficult engineering decisions that nobody's really thought through. Scheduling. When we model parallel data structures and so on, we often assume that the scheduler is fair, maybe the scheduler is random. Rarely do we say, well, the scheduler can be malicious. Malicious scheduling includes things like front running. I try to buy some stock. You put a transaction in front of my transaction that buys my stock and then resells it to me at a markup. Anytime you start worrying about priority batching and recovery, new things happen. It's a little bit like doing scheduling except with money. Final category, distributed computing. I got into blockchain when I noticed that a lot of what was going on, particularly in the early days, was reinventing concepts from distributed computing and giving them new names and not necessarily doing them correctly. So this seemed like a fun application area. Everything in this world is Byzantine. Crash failures are not really the focus of people's attention. You have to assume that if things go wrong, they go wrong in the worst possible way. This is interesting because, as I mentioned, Byzantine agreement went through a kind of Gartner hype curve. It was a hot area for a few years, and then people became on board with it, and now it's come back with a vengeance. A lot of protocols for things like broadcast, gossip, and so on are similar to classical distributed computing, except now we're doing this sometimes even literally with money, internet of money. And it's like designing concurrent data structures where you're worried about what can go wrong, except that your adversary is human instead of a random scheduler. Okay, and that's pretty much what I had to say about atomicity without trust. So I'm going to conclude, again with a little bit of perspective. What I've tried to do here is just to say that in the modern world, we transition from kind of well-defined, mathematically compact adversaries and problems to very open-ended, very complicated, and kind of morally ambiguous problems. Most of the work that I think needs to be done are things like devising protocols, doing algorithmic work, data structures, systems design, engineering. But a step here that doesn't, I think, get the attention it deserves is defining what it is that these things are supposed to do. And to this extent, I think we need to borrow notions from game theory and talk about deviating versus conforming outcomes, default protocols, that kind of a thing. None of this is very complicated. It's just not what we're used to. So in the end, you might think, perhaps not without reason, that blockchains are a little bit of a fad, that there's a lot of dubious things going on in this area. But as I said, blockchain is just a technology. The blockchains may come and go, different applications may come and go, but this idea that we want to find a way to cooperate in the absence of any kind of enforcement mechanisms, in the absence of trust, or at least very limited trust, is a basic problem that is never going to go away. Only the context in which we need to solve this can change. And I think this is an exciting area. This is also an area where established fields like PPoPP and distributed computing and others have an advantage that you may not realize, which is that the people who work in this area are busy reinventing things that we invented a long time ago, but with a twist. And that if we can pay attention to this, we can have a lot of fun. And basically with this thought, I'll leave you and open the floor for questions. Perhaps someone can tell me what I need to do to deal with questions.
Yes, so I think anybody can ask questions in the chat. There are no questions there yet. The organizers maybe could check if it's not technical, that it's technically possible to write the questions there. Maybe I'll take the opportunity before questions appear and ask you this no worse off notion. Is it where can I read about it? Is it like an old thing that was revived, or is it new?
I think this is kind of a standard notion in game theory. It's not clear that studying game theory as such is going to help. If you look at there's a lot of literature on atomic swaps in the blockchains, cross-chain communication, and there's always a possibility that the deal will go wrong. Someone could walk out in the middle, someone could refuse to participate, and so not going through is always something that can happen. And so that had better be an acceptable outcome. There's a small literature on premiums and adapting notions from classical finance to exchanges. The idea that if I renege on a deal partway through, then I have to pay everyone for their time. This is people who do finance study options, and there's a rich literature on how do you calculate what an option is worth. One of these cross-chain deals is kind of like an option, because I can say, I'd like to buy your Cadillac, and then before we complete the deal, I can check a website and say, ooh, pink Cadillacs have gone way down in value. I'm going to walk away because this deal no longer makes any sense. Or Cadillacs have gone way up, and you can say, oh, I no longer want to sell this because I just realized my Cadillac is worth more. So you want to set things up in such a way that if somebody does renege, then you compensate the other party. But the notion of no worse off is actually, I'm hiding a ton of sins under that innocuous phrase. Defining exactly what that means is complicated, to say the least. I'm relying on your naive confidence that you understand what this means.
Okay, so there is a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it to you, or?
Yes, because for some reason I can't. I'm having trouble seeing the chat on this
Okay.
feed.
So Siddharth Krishna asks, should we really be using blockchains in the age of climate change? Bitcoin consumes more electricity and emits more carbon than entire countries. What do you think?
So do not confound blockchains with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is kind of the black sheep of the blockchain world. Proof of work is a crime against the environment. Uh, m- Most modern blockchains use other techniques besides proof of work. You know, there are private um, blockchains that use various forms of Byzantine agreement. Algorand, the place that where I'm temporarily working, uses something called proof of stake, which is not environmentally destructive. So yes, I think Bitcoin is horrible, but Bitcoin is not a synonym for blockchains. If Bitcoin were to go away tomorrow, I don't think the blockchain world would be any worse off. I'm sure I will get death threats for saying that, but there you go.
Okay, I'll take one more question before we need to go to the second session, and then we can continue on Slack if anybody is wishing to that. Ahmed Hassan is saying, great talk, many thanks. My question is related to the front-running issue. Is the model you propose, should we consider it as a no worse off, or in practice there is an indirect harm to others?
So the correctness condition says that if you participate, you're no worse off. Again, defining what no worse off means leaves a lot of wiggle room. So something like front running is a hard problem because the nature of a lot of blockchain protocols permit front running. It's hard to prevent miners from doing that kind of thing. There are proposals where, for example, uh, bids to buy something or a pool together diluting the effect of front running. But this is an open area of research. This is something where this has been a problem on actual Wall Street in the real world for a long time. And I think that would be a great idea for a PhD thesis or a startup company to really solve that problem.
Cool. We have to be done, so we will thank you. And we cannot really do that. There are hundreds of people here, but I'll just clap for them. So thank you very much. It was a great talk, and we can continue on Slack. So
Okay,
we
thanks.
need to